to another episode of Unlocking California Politics. Today we are talking about Proposition 1, Treatment Not Tents, which is a ballot initiative that will be on the March ballot. It is the only initiative on the March ballot. It was introduced by Governor Gavin Newsom. To help us understand more about the initiative, we have with us today Jim DeBoo, who is managing the Proposition 1 campaign and is founder of the public affairs and political consulting firm DeBoo Strategic Affairs. Jim also served as Governor Newsom's chief of staff from 2020 to 2023 and has a long and distinguished career in Sacramento policy and politics. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate being here today.
So let's dive in. California voters are soon going to be getting or have already received their ballots for the primary election. And on it, they are going to see Proposition 1, again, the only proposition on the ballot, Treatment Not Tents, which is a great slogan. Homelessness and the unhoused are among the top priorities for Californians these days. It doesn't seem to matter whether you're in suburbs or urban cores. It's on people's mind in basically every way. I think there's a lot of compassion for the homeless situation, and concern, but also people are especially nowadays also concerned about safety and other issues that go along with homelessness. Can you tell us first what is Proposition 1?
Yeah, and thanks for having me today. And I think when we talk about Prop 1, there's a little bit of history that has to be discussed in California. And at one time, we actually had thousands of people housed back in the 50s and 60s. And what happened during the late 50s and early 60s was those beds, those 37,000 beds that we had, they were dismantled by different politicians in a bipartisan fashion. But over time, those beds disappeared, and what happened with those folks just ended up in the streets. And over those years, both cities and counties never were able to really figure out how to deal with that mental health kind of crisis that occurred. So what Prop 1 attempts to do is kind of right those wrongs that we've never addressed before. And it's a pretty simple ballot measure in that it does two very basic things. The first piece is it's a bond, a over $6 billion bond to house those folks that are unhoused. And if I harken back to my days as governor's chief of staff, one of the biggest fights that we witnessed was the cities and counties arguing over who was responsible for what. And the courts as well, when we try to clear encampments, coming in and saying, you can't clear these encampments unless you have these folks housed. So what we're attempting to do with the counties, since they're responsible for providing mental health services and the cities are responsible for providing housing, is giving them that ability to do so with the bond. And that bond's broken down into a couple different components. Most of it goes for different types of supportive housing. So crisis intervention housing, which is short term, and then also long-term housing. So for folks like Project Home Key, so in the state during COVID, we bought hotels, and we're going to extend that program. But those hotel rooms were really for long-term homes for people who were suffering from homelessness. So you have those pieces. There's $1 billion in the bond also for veterans. There's over 10,000 veterans that are on the streets right now. And over the years, the legislature has always tried to house those folks, and this does that as well. And then a little bit of malleability with about $1 billion for local governments to figure out what the best is for supportive housing. Also within this is leveraging for federal funding. So not all the money is unmatched by the federal government. So there's matching funds, as well as workforce development. We have a crisis with healthcare workers in the state of California. And if we really want to address trying to get the mental health paradigm fixed and people off the streets, we need more healthcare workers. So the bond also helps to upscale and to bring more people into the mental health workforce. That's the first part. The second part is the Mental Health Services Act. And Senator Joel Steinberg, who represented Sacramento here in the state Senate, he was the very first author of the MHSA, is what it's affectionately referred to. And that was a 1% tax on pretty much the wealthiest Californians, $1 million or over. And that provided money mostly for counties to deal with mental health. There was one major flaw in MHSA when it was passed. You couldn't use it for substance abuse, which, as everyone knows, folks who are on the street are suffering from substance abuse. So this proposition amends the MHSA, allows for substance abuse to be a part of the funding that's used there for that funding. But it also goes a little bit further, and it tells local governments, counties in particular, we really need you to use this to make sure people are getting into housing, to make sure that they're getting wraparound services, and to make sure that money is going towards the pieces of care that we need to see folks get inside and into treatment. And so between those two pieces and what the legislature has done with conservatorship reform to make it
Hmm.
easier for families to say, my loved one can't take care of themselves. I want them to be put into a treatment facility, and care court, which the governor and the legislature
Right.
passed, which allows for folks to go through a court process to say, hey, you really need to be into mandatory treatment. Those, all four of those things, or three of those things, basically, with Prop 1 being third, really lock in, hopefully, that to repair that piece of what I just talked about, which is it's kind of closing the loop on what we did in the 50s and 60s to recreate the mental health structure that we need in California.
So the care court to some extent does, as you mentioned, allow allows for conservatorship by relatives and other persons who have a concerned interest in certain members of the homeless community. And it seems like so that in many ways was targeting some of the more extreme situations of homelessness. Is this a broader population to be served than the
Oh,
care courts?
yeah, absolutely. Because it's not just the homeless. This is mental health as a whole. So the funding from the MHSA portion of this bond, and even for the housing side of it, sometimes this is just for people to go in for a short-term care. So it's not just about the homeless population as a whole. It's a large part of it, but
Hmm.
it's also about mental health. And I'll give you an example. In my family, we've had mental health, and I think everybody shares this, issues. And a lot of issues are like things that you want to have outpatient care, but that might not be available for your loved one because there wasn't resources for it. And this is
Right.
the portion of the bond will create those beds and those treatment slots. That's the other big thing on the housing piece. When we started in the 50s and 60s, there was 37,000 beds essentially. We're down to 5,000 beds. What the bond will allow for is not only basically 11,500 beds, but it's 26,000 treatment slots, and that
Right.
serves around 100,000 people a year because not everybody's going to have need to be into a housing situation
Right.
for more than a week, more than a few days. So that piece of it's really, really important that we're recreating that piece to serve that 100,000 people, which is again not just homeless, but the mentally ill.
One concern which I hear from some of my friends, from the Los Angeles area. There have been some homeless connected bonds, mental health bonds, and I think there's concern about, are you getting value for your money? Some of these projects have, ballooned in cost, or very few people get served. What kind of accountability measures are built in?
And that's a great question. One of the big things we learned, especially I did when I was in the governor's office, when we did homeless funding for the local governments when I was there. And one of the pieces that we had put in was accountability measures. And some of the local governments came back and said, we said, you have to come back and present your plan. Well, the plans included increases in the homeless population, which the governor summarily rejected. We took that and put that thought process into Prop 1. So there's accountability metrics on the money itself, but more importantly, the money, because it has some federal, drawdowns
Hmm.
that we can do, plus the fact that we can use existing programs like Home Key, plus the fact that it also has local government streamlining,
Okay.
we're looking at a couple $100,000 a unit. And I understand, I've seen it. The LA bond where they said it was
Right.
$800,000 a unit. That is not this. This is not the panacea, but this is going to allow for a much easier, lower cost construction. And we get to use existing programs like Home Key, where we're continuing to buy or expand buying of old hotels and motels. So the funding piece of it isn't as egregious as people would think. It's actually much better, and there's accountability metrics. So if the counties aren't doing what they're supposed to do, which they don't love, I will say,
Right.
the state has the ability to come in and rectify or to have a discussion about funding.
Okay, good. Because as I said, that's something I get a lot about that concern. So I figured there would be accountability built in. Um, as you mentioned, there one of the changes is to allow for treatment of addiction. And can you speak a little to the history of maybe why that was not a part of the original legislation on this?
It goes back for a while.
Mhm.
I'm not sure at the time why they didn't include that specifically, but there's always been addiction when it comes to mental health. But
Right.
fentanyl, wasn't around.
Right.
It's exploded. I think people recognize how deadly that is, even different forms of heroin and things like that. So when it was initially done, the MHSA was also targeted at children,
Hmm.
and that wasn't as big of an issue then. But what I will say is, the author Darrell Steinberg is one of the sponsors of the ballot
Hmm.
measure because he recognizes it, and so I think it's evolved. I do think it was a miss, but I don't think it was intentional. I think it was unintentional.
Okay.
And I think now what people are seeing is if you're not dealing with substance abuse, you're not dealing with those addictions that are fentanyl in particular, which is so addictive, you're not going to be able to ever get to the root of the problem. And it opens up that funding, which is what it needs to be for mental health reform. It's a huge part of getting people off the streets.
Yeah, and that makes sense because it's also seems like a lot of persons who are not getting mental health treatment who need it, they'll often be self-medicating
Yeah,
with narcotics, and so
yeah.
they might be attempting to actually deal with their mental health issues through narcotics, and so it should be
Well,
definitely be a
especially
part
if,
of
I
it.
mean, look, if you're out on the streets and we see it every day, today, Sacramento, it's raining, it's cold. To try to just to get through the day, people are self-medicating.
Right.
And you can understand it from a human perspective about how difficult it must be if you have some form of mental illness and you're out on the streets and you're trying to live through that. Of course, people are self-medicating. And so this does try to address that. And we'll get to the piece of it, but also getting people off the streets that don't have the capability to take care of themselves, which I think most people would view as a humane thing to do. Leaving people out on the streets to die. Sacramento had the
Right.
highest this last year. They had over 250 people die on the streets.
Wow.
They think this year for 2023, it'll be over 250 people most likely. It is inhumane for us to sit back and to allow for people to die out on the streets.
And that is a tie-in to something that has always sort of struck me about this. This proposition, as well as C.A.R. courts, received fair degree of opposition from certain types of disability rights groups who argue any type of compelled treatment is improper. And that's always struck me as a little odd because if you don't, you might be so have mental health issues that you can't even recognize that you need help. How do you respond to those critiques or concerns?
I think there's a few ways to respond to it. Number one, again, I go back to this. It's it is as a society, it is not compassionate to leave people on the streets to die. If you've ever walked an encampment, and I've walked plenty, and you meet with people that are out there, they have different reasons for not wanting necessarily to come into treatment, but most of them don't have the capacity sometimes to even make those personal decisions for themselves anymore. And if you talk to a parent or a brother or a
Hmm.
sister or whomever it may be who has a loved one that's out on the streets, they're begging sometimes for people to get them into treatment, and they haven't had the ability to do that. So I would argue, and I think it's, again, it is so inhumane to allow people to be out on the streets to die. I mean, Sheriff Jim Cooper from Sacramento, one of the reasons he endorsed Prop 1 was that women on the streets right now, 40% are victims of sexual assault. That is inhuman. So for us to defend the status quo and to say that people should be out on the streets and they should live in the conditions that they live in without intervening, that to me is inhumane. And then this isn't the idea that we're going to go back to the 50s and 60s of the state hospitals where there's that's never going to happen again. This is the whole idea is to get people in, get them into wraparound services, get them treatment, get them back on their feet so they can try to live as happy of a life as they can. And that helps everyone.
Yeah, and I think I've had some friends who are on that, I guess, the extreme side of the civil liberties spectrum, and I said, look, we're not going to be state's not because you're whistling and talking to yourself. Nobody. The situation is so far gone. That's not even on the radar
No.
screen. And
Yeah.
some time ago in the LA Times, I remember there'd been an article. This is years ago in Silver Lake area, how all the community businesses, residents were watching this one couple basically deteriorate on the
Yeah.
streets. They went to the police, they went to people, and everybody's like, well, they don't want help. And so, oh, well. And basically that it went really bad.
Yeah.
And yeah, now it just seems like ridiculous to say, oh, well, There's nothing we can
No,
do.
and look, I lived in San Francisco for a long time, and I had a couple of homeless folks who basically, when they could, they would live on our front porch, and
Right.
they would, you know, they were heroin addicts. They would inject themselves and, write with blood on our garage doors and things like that. And I do remember when Gavin Newsom was mayor and he did Care Not Cash. I lived in San Francisco, and I remember an advocate knocking on my door and saying they have the right to do that. And I was like, those folks need help so badly to get back on their feet. This can't be a healthy way for them to live. And the fact that you're defending the status quo like that, to me, showed that you don't have compassion for those folks. So I'm in
Right.
your camp. I find it's hard for me to sit and listen to people say that it's okay for people to be out on the streets who can't take care of themselves, who aren't mental health requires lots of different treatments. They have access, but they're not able to get prescriptions. They're not able to
Right.
sit, they're not able to get care. They're not able to get medical care. And to say that they deserve to be on the streets so they can die, I think is, as a society, as a democracy, that is absolutely the worst way you can look at something.
Well, it's interesting you said earlier that this is kind of a response to the failures of the initial sort of discharge and closing of the state hospitals. Because I know in some states, I'm not sure about in California, they were closing the state hospitals with the assumption that, oh, we'll have community care facilities
Exactly.
and everything will be
Exactly.
fine. And then they discovered, oh, without better interventions, people wouldn't go to the community care facilities,
Mm-mm.
or let's cut some funding. There go the community care facilities, and nobody, because they're
100%.
not going, and it's ended up where we are
Yeah.
today. And so you're right. You need a full spectrum of
Yeah,
intervention
and
to
the
help
idea
people.
and the idea behind Prop 1 again is, and care court and conservatorship reform, all those things, they all interact with each other, but it's to reconstitute a continuum of care and mental health. It's not to reestablish the state hospitals, from a perspective of what people view though of state hospitals from the 50s and 60s when it was
Right.
lobotomies and things like that. Like there's that specter that's going to happen. That will never happen again. And the way that we're taught, this is about continuum of care. It's about wraparound services, about making sure that you have mental health, you have physical health, you have housing. Because one of the big reasons that people are on the streets, and I understand this, when they have conjugate care, which is, one big room with 25 bunks,
Mhm.
that doesn't work because people get assaulted, their stuff gets
Right.
stolen, they don't feel safe. That makes sense. So you have to have that housing component. But if you have that housing component and you have that continuum of care, you have those healthcare services available, mental health services available. And even if it's like, hey, you have to be here in some cases, if you're going through care court or
Mhm.
conservatorship, that's how you take care of people.
Right. And you've mentioned housing. Now, there are communities, there are areas that have been resistant to homeless shelters and temporary housing being built in their communities, which has always struck me in a way as a little odd. I remember, and I think the opposition actually dropped away. I think this was I can't remember what part of Los Angeles. There was a lot of objection.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking to myself, so is it better that people are just on the street? Isn't it better that they're in the housing as opposed to being on the street in front of your house? But how do you address those concerns, and
Uh,
do you see resistance as being a
Yeah,
problem for this
I
initiative?
I think I don't see resistance being a problem for this initiative, but yeah, people have that. I live in, East Sacramento here, and my view is like, look, if we had a housing for homeless folks and they were off the streets and in a safe place, that's a much better outcome than them walking around the streets, and being homeless. So, and mental health as well. Just
Mhm.
the mental health paradigm of having people um who need the help that are in getting treatment, like, I'm okay with that, but I understand there's a fear from some people about, like, what does that look like? What does that mean? But the pushback usually comes, um, a lot of times, from NIMBYs, which there's a lot of that when it comes to construction of housing. There's a lot of that when it's
Mhm.
construction of whatever it is in their neighborhood, and there is a streamlining aspect to this initiative that allows for those projects to be built faster. Do I think there's gonna be a lot of pushback? I think it's lessening, but I also think people have to understand, like, you have to prove rightfully to the neighborhoods, to the neighbors, to the people that are there. This isn't just us throwing up some housing and putting people in there. It's that these services are gonna be there so they will feel safe. They will be a safe space for the people that are inside of those units, and that it's not gonna affect the surrounding neighborhoods. Any It'll be better than the situations they're in
Mhm.
now, and that I think we deserve the people who are the Californians who are going to be facing this and seeing, some new construction. Some of this is, for
Hmm.
example, in LA, there's old hospitals that they're
Right.
retrofitting, right? That we can retrofit. So some of it won't be new. It'll be just retrofitting, which is great, saves us money. But in some cases, it will be new. And we owe it to the people to tell them what this really means. And it's not just housing; it's everything else that comes with it.
Um, the health of people reflects their communities. Why would this be an issue of particular concern to realtors?
Look, that's a great question, but I think all realtors are like they're at the tip of the spear of communities. They are the ones who are from the community usually because they're selling in the
Hmm.
communities they live in. They're part of the community and that they're part of most of the groups or associations because they want the community to thrive. They're also people that are selling the community. And so if you're selling a community to someone, you want it to be as not pristine, but you want it to be inviting. You want to be able to talk, with confidence about the schools. You want to be able to talk about confidence about the crime rates being low, the property values being high. This measures whole thing from a realtor's perspective is to help people get off the streets. And that to me, for all of those reasons, if you're a realtor, both personally and professionally, you should be interested in this initiative passing because it matters to your community. I can't think of a group that would be more at the tip of this issue and dealing
Hmm.
with it on a daily basis than realtors.
Yeah, historically, our association has not, for various reasons, weighed in on these types of issues. But for all the reasons I think you've just talked about, we have definitely, and one reason for this podcast is a growing interest in addressing this whole situation. And so, yeah, this is something which I think most of our membership who'll be listening to this is aware of the importance of this. And I think you've hit on the main issues. One thing I also noticed in the ballot arguments is it looks like you're enjoying a fair degree of support from law enforcement for this. I noticed the Orange County
hmm
sheriffs and police supporting this. Can you speak to some of the law enforcement
Yeah,
support for
I mean,
this?
I'll just say this: I have never worked on a measure that has more bipartisan support. Just to start at the top, you mentioned, Governor Newsom. This is part of it. Well, Shannon Grove, State Senator Shannon Grove, who's former minority leader of the Senate, Republican,
Hmm.
very conservative
Very
Republican.
conservative, right?
She's a supporter as well. She just wrote an op-ed in favor of Prop One. So we have this massive amount of bipartisan support. Law enforcement, it's writ large. We've got Sheriff Cooper from Sacramento, Sheriff Luna from Los Angeles, the Police Chiefs Association, the Police Officers Association, Fire. As you saw,
Right.
we have CSLEA, the Law Enforcement Association, and one of our executive committee members is the Correctional Peace Officers Association,
Mm,
and
okay.
there's various reasons for that. The Correctional Peace Officers Association, they recognize that this is really important for them because they don't want to be mental health experts,
Right.
right? Like, and so getting people out of incarceration and into treatment is very important for them.
Right. That makes sense.
So for them, there's that big piece. And then what I talked about with like Sheriff Cooper, his big thing is like the people who are out on the streets, there is an immense, not only is it, the homelessness piece with this mental health, blight, all this crime, but it's the assault for him, it was that. It was like, look, there's sexual assault that happens at high, it's rampant in this community. And so we have these various folks who are from law enforcement are saying, this is what we need to do to get people off the streets. Police and fire, they shouldn't be the behavioral health officers. They want to go do their police work. And for them, I think they recognize that this is really, really important for their communities, for CCPOA to make sure that mental health piece is taken out of the prisons and put back into an area that provides treatment, and overall just to help fix the communities. But it's great, and I have again never had so much, not just law enforcement, but bipartisan support on anything I've worked on probably in my career.
On the I guess opposition side to this, there's been some. I noticed in the ballot argument there's some mention of some cities being concerned. Do you think it's because of the accountability piece, or
It's mostly so that the cities are that most cities have endorsed,
correct?
and the big 13 mayors, all of them. In fact, there was an event today with all 13 of them who have endorsed. The counties, there are behavioral health because again,
Hmm.
they've a lot of folks have had the MHSA, the Mental Health Services Act, funding at the county level for so long that they're kind of entrenched in current programs. And there is a shift that they're going to have to make with some of those programs. And I think there's a little, grumbling about that. But
Right.
what I would say is this: that pot of money has grown to almost started at 1.3 billion when it was first at 3 billion now a year.
Okay.
The status quo is not working. So
Right.
we have to do something different. And we think this is the appropriate way to do it with the accountability measures that are over the top of it.
And you mentioned bipartisan support. I couldn't help but notice basically I almost want to say the whole major business community has backed
Absolutely.
this. Cal Chamber, Business Properties, California Business Roundtable. How do you explain the support of the business? Do you think it's the same kind of the realtor issue that they're members of the community?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like if you talk about the chamber, small businesses across the state, especially in urban cores that deal with this every day, the idea that there could be some relief to them of getting, because look, everybody, to your point when you started this, people are compassionate, but they also have to live their lives. And when you're a small business, that can affect you dramatically. So I think for small businesses like and the chamber representing those folks and some of the small business properties association folks like that, they're looking at this saying, hey, this may not solve all the ills, but it's a big step in the right direction to help us get back to a place where like the core portions of cities or areas where there's density and there's homeless issues and mental health issues, that they can get folks out from in front of their storefronts, out from in front of their business properties, and back into a place where people are excited to be, in those areas again and feel safe.
And as you mentioned, it is one of those rare initiatives or even anything where you do see such bipartisan support. Like a lot of people, prior to my getting involved in the political side, I used to kind of shorthand when you're voting on initiatives. Well, who supports it and who opposes it?
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
go.
yeah,
I'll go that way, and then it's like, oh, everybody's on. Almost everybody's here. Labor, business,
yeah,
cops. Civil rights groups. Everybody seems here, except again, maybe some exceptions on the opposed. But it seems like a pretty bipartisan
yeah.
very bipartisan group supporting this initiative. It seems pretty universal. Now, you mentioned, and I'm glad you addressed it about the 11,000 treatment beds, but how that's just the treatment beds, and it would, if you could just go over again how that multiplier works in terms of how many people would get
Sure,
treated.
sure. So it's basically 11,500 beds.
And is that
Um,
in addition to the existing beds, or
it's new beds, yeah.
right?
So that'll bring it up to 16,000 something.
Okay,
There's 26,000 treatment slots. And because not everybody needs to have beds.
right.
Sometimes it's just treatment. And the way, I mean, and again, I'm not an expert on the calculation of how they get here, but basically with that amount of both beds and treatment slots, it services about 100,000 people a year, which is a hard thing for people to hear. That's a big number. But that's what, when we were going through this process and our Health and Human Services Agency analyzed this, that's what they felt like was doable. And that's a pretty big chunk of the people who are either out on the streets or have mental health issues. So you're talking about 100,000 folks that's being provided. That's a pretty big number. So again, the beds increase, almost twice as what we have now. But the treatment slots are really, really important as well. And that's new treatment slots and it'll serve those 100,000 people. And again, in addition to that, it's having to build up that healthcare service and bringing in new employees and upskilling people to be able to take care of this influx in a positive influx. We hope it's a massive influx of mental health services.
One thing which I thought was good about the care courts in terms of its implementation was how it was so broadly implemented throughout the whole
Hmm.
state. And actually, I had a member of our association once talking about care courts and saying, "Yeah, I figure anything that Orange County and San Francisco wants, it must have
Yeah,
something to
yeah,
it."
yeah, yeah,
But yeah, you made sure that it was Shasta and all
yeah.
through the different parts of the state. Would there be a similar attempt made? Because I know there's sometimes concern, like, "Oh, is this really just for San Francisco and LA?"
No, no. So,
Um,
so great question. MHSA, the counties would still have the same allocation that they've always had. They just have to follow the rubric that's being set out within the ballot measure, and they have the ability now to use the money for substance abuse. So that doesn't change. And it's basically the same on the bond. The bond is more about where can we build these, facilities as fast as we possibly can, and what existing resources do we already have. So if, I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but if you're Shasta County and you have home key and you want to expand that, you're going to have the ability to do that.
Okay.
But there will be some new construction. But like LA, for example, there's already a few sites that the county's identified that are either retrofitted healthcare entities that we can go in very quickly and just update and move quickly. So it'll be spread out around. And then again, there's $1 billion in there for veterans for
Right.
that very specific purpose, just to make sure that that veterans, like I said, 10,000 on the street right now, have a place to go. So it'll be pretty equitably spread across the state.
Right. I did notice also, again, on the ballot arguments and generally on the various pamphlets, that you have support from, I think, all the major veterans groups
Yes,
on this one as well.
Support from the veterans group, support from law enforcement, support from all of most of the mental health,
Right.
NAMI, the largest national mental health organizations, and every, like you said, from labor to business, it's really been fascinating and
Right.
fun to work with all these folks.
It's rare when you see, it's always interesting to me when you see, wow, SEIU and the chamber
Yeah,
on the
no,
same side.
It is. It's like people who are, in our world, in the Capitol, who are literally fighting each other
Right.
every day, hand-to-hand combat, are holding hands on this one. And it's just a very interesting place to be. And it goes back to and it's the same reason why it's odd to see Shannon Grove and Gavin Newsom on something
Right.
together.
That's true.
But it is because it's mental health. And it's
Right.
something that affects everyone. And it's not a partisan issue. It's very hard to make mental health a partisan issue. So
that actually sounds like your last words, but I was
Yeah.
going to say, if you have any last words that you'd like to share with our listeners.
no, I just really appreciate the time. And, as realtors, facing the state and dealing, again, frontline, whether it's inflation, whether it's construction of housing, whether it's something like mental health, I hope so at some point, if you can consider supporting, it'd be great. But again, I just thanks for the time.
All right. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks.
Disclaimer. The purpose of this podcast, brought to you by the California Association of Realtors, C.A.R., is to provide general and educational information and opinions from a wide range of perspectives regarding politics, voting, elections, legislative issues, and more. The opinions, beliefs, and views expressed by guests or participants of this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, beliefs, or views of C.A.R., its affiliates, their respective directors, officers, or employees. Reference to any individual or entity does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or any other position or opinion regarding that entity or individual by C.A.R. This podcast does not constitute professional advice or services of any kind. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast.